In December 1941, Japanese pilots swept across the Pacific like avenging angels. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, Malaya. Everywhere they flew, they dominated. American and British aircraft fell from the sky like leaves in autumn. It seemed like nothing could stop them. Japanese Naval Command was euphoric. The reports from the front were almost too good to believe. American pilots were running. They were refusing to fight. They were abandoning their aircraft on the ground rather than face the Emperor's warriors in the sky. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. American pilots were cowards, they said, soft, spoiled by their comfortable lives. They had no warrior spirit. They would never stand and fight against true samurai. The pilots who actually flew those missions knew better, but Tokyo didn't want to hear what they had to say. This is the story of what Japanese pilots really thought about their American enemies, the assessments that contradicted the official line, the warnings that were ignored, the truth that stunned Tokyo when it could no longer be denied. And it begins with a man named Saburo Sakai. Saburo Sakai was everything Japanese propaganda said a pilot should be. Born in 1916 to a samurai family that had fallen on hard times, he joined the Imperial Japanese Navy as an enlisted man in 1933. He worked his way up through sheer determination, eventually earning a place in the elite naval aviation program. By December 1941, Sakai was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Japanese Navy. He had been flying combat missions over China for years. He had shot down numerous enemy aircraft. He knew his Zero fighter inside and out, could fly it like an extension of his own body. When the war with America began, Sakai was stationed in the Philippines. He flew on the first day of the war, part of the massive air assault that destroyed American air power on the ground. He watched as row after row of American aircraft burned, caught unprepared, just like at Pearl Harbor. The victory was overwhelming, but Sakai was troubled by what he observed. The Americans hadn't fought back because they hadn't had a chance to fight back. They had been caught completely by surprise, their aircraft destroyed before they could even take off. That wasn't cowardice, that was bad luck and worse planning. Sakai suspected the Americans would be different when they had a chance to fight on equal terms. He was right. To understand what the Japanese pilots experienced, you need to understand the weapon they flew. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the finest carrier-based fighter in the world when the war began. It was fast, maneuverable, and had extraordinary range. It could fly rings around anything the Americans had in the Pacific in 1941. The Zero achieved its performance through ruthless weight reduction. Every ounce that could be eliminated was eliminated. The aircraft had no armor protection for the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. A single bullet in the right place could turn a Zero into a fireball. Japanese doctrine held that the best defense was offensive skill. A truly skilled pilot wouldn't get hit. Armor was for pilots who expected to be shot at, which meant pilots who had already failed. The Zero was designed for warriors, not survivors. The American F-4F Wildcat was a very different philosophy made metal. It was slower than the Zero. It couldn't climb as fast. It couldn't turn as tight. But it was built like a tank. It had armor behind the pilot's seat. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb bullet hits without exploding. It could take punishment that would destroy a Zero. Japanese pilots initially dismissed the Wildcat as inferior. It was slower, it was less maneuverable. Surely it would fall easily to the superior Zero. They were about to learn that specifications on paper didn't tell the whole story. The first serious air combat between Japanese and American pilots came in the early months of 1942. At Coral Sea in May and Midway in June, American carrier aircraft tangled with Japanese Zeros in the largest aerial battles yet seen in the Pacific. The results shocked Japanese pilots. The Americans didn't run, they fought, and they fought well. At Midway, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch demonstrated a new tactic that would revolutionize American fighter doctrine. The Thatch weave used pairs of Wildcats flying in a scissoring pattern, each pilot protecting the other's tail. When a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, the other would cross over and get a shot at the attacker. The tactic neutralized the Zero's superior maneuverability. Japanese pilots couldn't stay on a Wildcat's tail long enough to get a killing shot without exposing themselves to the wingman. The Americans were using teamwork to compensate for their individual disadvantage. Saburo Sakai later wrote about encountering the Thatch weave. The Americans were learning. They were no longer fighting as individuals. They fought as pairs, as teams. Every time I got behind one Grumman, another was shooting at me. It was very difficult. This assessment would have been heresy in Tokyo. The official line was that American pilots were inferior, that they could never match Japanese warrior spirit. Sakai knew better, but saying so would have been dangerous. Guadalcanal changed everything. When American Marines landed on that jungle island in August 1942 and seized the airfield the Japanese were building, it forced Japan into a battle of attrition they couldn't win. The airfield, renamed Henderson Field by the Americans, became the pivot of the campaign. Japanese bombers attacked it daily, trying to destroy it. American fighters rose to defend it. The result was months of brutal air combat that bled the Japanese Naval Aviation Corps white. Japanese pilots flew from Rabaul, over 500 miles away. They arrived over Guadalcanal at the extreme edge of their range, with barely enough fuel to fight and return. American pilots, operating from Henderson Field, were fresh and fully fueled. The advantage had shifted. Saburo Sakai flew over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the first day of the American invasion. What he found stunned him. The Americans had built a working fighter defense in barely 24 hours. Marine and Navy aircraft were already rising to meet the Japanese attackers. In the dogfight that followed, Sakai shot down several American aircraft, but he also made a nearly fatal mistake. He attacked what he thought was a group of Wildcats. They were actually SBD Dauntless dive bombers, which carried rear-facing machine guns. A burst of fire from a rear gunner hit Sakai directly in the face. The bullets tore through his skull, destroying his right eye and temporarily paralyzing his left side. He was blinded, bleeding, barely conscious, over 500 miles from home. What Sakai did next became legend. Fighting to stay conscious, he flew his damaged Zero all the way back to Rabaul. He navigated by the position of the sun, which he could barely see through his surviving eye. He landed without incident, then collapsed from blood loss. While recovering from his wounds, Sakai had time to think about what he had witnessed at Guadalcanal. The Americans had fought with skill and courage. They had adapted to the Zero's strengths and found ways to compensate. They were not cowards. They were not inferior. They were learning, and they were getting better every day. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Japanese pilots sent increasingly alarming reports back to Tokyo. The reports were professional, detailed, specific, and they directly contradicted everything the propaganda machine was telling the Japanese public. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a senior naval aviation officer, documented the warnings that were being sent back from the front. Pilots reported that American aircraft were improving rapidly. The new Corsair and Hellcat fighters were faster than the Zero and far more rugged. American pilots were developing tactics that negated the Zero's advantages. Most disturbingly, the pilots reported that American pilot training was improving while Japanese training was declining. Japan had started the war with a small corps of superbly trained aviators, but those pilots were dying over places like Guadalcanal, and their replacements were inadequate. Okumiya wrote after the war, "Our frontline pilots were reporting that American pilots were becoming more skilled with each passing month. They were making fewer mistakes. They were working better as teams. Meanwhile, our own replacement pilots were arriving with half the training of those they replaced. We were losing the qualitative edge that had given us victory in 1941. Tokyo didn't want to hear it. The official position was that Japanese pilots were inherently superior, that one Japanese warrior was worth 10 Americans. To admit otherwise would be to question the entire basis of the war. So the warnings were ignored, the reports were filed and forgotten, and the dying continued. After the war, American intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with surviving Japanese pilots. The interviews were classified for decades, but they paint a picture very different from the wartime propaganda. One pilot, a lieutenant commander who had fought from the Philippines to Okinawa, was asked about his assessment of American pilots. His answer stunned his interrogators. American pilots were aggressive, very aggressive. They would attack even when outnumbered. They would press their attacks even when damaged. We had been told they were cowards who would run from a fight. That was not true. They were brave men. Another pilot, asked about American tactics, responded, "Their teamwork was excellent. They never fought alone, always in pairs or fours or larger formations. If you attacked one, another would attack you. It was very frustrating, very dangerous." A third pilot, who had fought at the Philippine Sea, gave perhaps the most damning assessment. By 1944, American pilots were better trained than ours. They flew better aircraft. They had better tactics, and there were so many of them. For every one we shot down, 10 more appeared. We knew we could not win. These assessments would have been shocking to the Japanese public, which had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about American weakness, but they were no surprise to the pilots who had actually faced Americans in combat. The F-6F Hellcat entered service in 1943, and it changed everything. Here was an American fighter that was actually faster than the Zero,
It could climb nearly as fast. It could dive much faster. And it retained all the ruggedness that made American aircraft so hard to kill. The Hellcat was specifically designed to defeat the Zero. American engineers had studied a captured Zero in detail, learning its strengths and weaknesses. They designed the Hellcat to exploit every weakness they found. Japanese pilots quickly learned to fear the big American fighter. Saburo Sakai, returning to combat in 1944 after recovering from his wounds, found a completely different war than the one he had left. The Hellcat was a fearsome opponent, he wrote. It was faster than us, it could dive away when in trouble, and it was almost impossible to shoot down. Many pilots I had trained went up against Hellcats and never came back. The numbers tell the story. Hellcat pilots would eventually claim over 5,000 Japanese aircraft destroyed, achieving a kill ratio of 19-1. No other fighter in history would achieve such lopsided results in such large numbers. But the Hellcat's success wasn't just about the aircraft. It was about the pilots who flew it. American naval aviators in 1944 were the best trained pilots in the world. They had logged hundreds of hours of flight time. They had practiced air combat tactics until they were second nature. They worked together as teams with an efficiency the Japanese couldn't match. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant new pilots arrived at their units with barely 100 hours of flight time. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target. They were sent up against Hellcat pilots with 5 times their experience. The results were predictable and catastrophic. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history. The moment when everything Japanese pilots had been warning about came true in the most devastating way possible. The Japanese fleet had 9 carrier fleets with 450 aircraft. The American fleet had 15 carriers with 900 aircraft. But the numbers only told part of the story. The American pilots were veterans, many with combat experience from Guadalcanal and the island-hopping campaigns. They flew Hellcats, the best carrier fighters in the world. They had trained together, fought together, developed tactics together. The Japanese pilots were mostly replacements. The veterans of Pearl Harbor and Midway were almost all dead. These new pilots had been rushed through abbreviated training programs, some with as little as 2 months of flight instruction. They had never seen combat. What followed was a massacre.
The Japanese launched 4 massive strikes against the American fleet. American radar detected them while they were still 100 miles away. Hellcats were vectored out to intercept, climbing to altitude with plenty of time to set up their attacks. The Japanese formations never reached the American ships. Wave after wave of attackers was cut to pieces by Hellcats before they could even see their targets. Inexperienced pilots panicked, broke formation, became easy prey. The Zeros that tried to escort them were hopelessly outmatched. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. They shot down nearly 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The Japanese lost 3 aircraft carriers to submarine attacks. When the battle ended, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. A Japanese pilot who survived the battle was asked afterward what had happened. His response was recorded by American intelligence. "We were children against men. Our pilots had no experience. Their pilots were experts. We were slaughtered." After the Philippine Sea, Japan faced an impossible situation.
Their trained pilots were dead. Their aircraft were obsolete. Their carriers were on the bottom of the ocean. Conventional air combat was no longer possible. The response was the kamikaze. If Japanese pilots couldn't shoot down American aircraft, they could at least crash into American ships. A Zero loaded with explosives, flown by a pilot who didn't plan to come back, was a weapon that even the mighty Hellcat couldn't completely stop. The kamikaze campaigns revealed something important about what Japanese military leaders really thought of their pilots. The elaborate pretense of samurai warrior superiority was dropped. Pilots were now disposable weapons to be expended in one-way attacks because they weren't skilled enough to fight conventionally. Saburo Sakai was asked to lead a kamikaze unit. He refused, not because he feared death, but because he saw the waste. "I had spent years learning to fight," he wrote. "They wanted me to throw away all that training in a single moment. It made no sense." Other veteran pilots felt the same way. They saw the kamikaze for what it was, an admission of defeat. Japan couldn't match American pilots in the air, so they would sacrifice their own young men in suicide attacks. It was desperation disguised as honor. The kamikaze attacks killed thousands of American sailors. They were terrifying and devastating, but they couldn't change the outcome of the war. By the time the kamikaze campaigns began, the Japanese had already lost. They just hadn't admitted it yet. After Japan's surrender, American intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings of Japanese pilots and commanders. The interviews were remarkable for their candor. Men who had spent years telling their superiors what they wanted to hear now spoke freely. A senior naval aviation commander was asked when he first realized Japan would lose the air war. His answer, Guadalcanal. "When I saw the reports from Guadalcanal, I knew we were in trouble. The Americans were learning too fast. They were adapting, and we were losing our best pilots faster than we could replace them." Another officer, asked about American pilot quality, responded, "At the beginning, we had the advantage in training and experience, but the Americans caught up quickly. By 1943, they were equal. By 1944, they were better, much better." The interviewers asked what qualities American pilots possessed. The answers were consistent: aggressiveness, teamwork, discipline, and determination. These were the exact qualities Japanese propaganda had claimed Americans lacked. One pilot gave a particularly memorable assessment. "We were told Americans were soft and would not fight. This was not true. They were hard men. They came after us again and again. When we shot one down, more came. They never gave up. They never quit. In the end, that was what defeated us." Saburo Sakai survived the war. He had shot down at least 64 Allied aircraft, making him one of Japan's top aces. He had been wounded, blinded in one eye, and yet continued fighting until the very end. After the war, Sakai wrote a memoir called Samurai that became a bestseller in both Japan and America. In it, he gave his honest assessment of the American pilots he had fought against. "The Americans were worthy opponents," he wrote. "They were brave, they were skilled, they learned from their mistakes faster than we did, and they had something we did not have. They kept getting better while we got worse." Sakai was critical of Japanese leadership, which had dismissed American pilots as inferior and refused to acknowledge the growing crisis. Our leaders believed their own propaganda, he wrote. They told themselves that Japanese spirit would overcome American material. They were wrong. Spirit cannot stop bullets. In his later years, Sakai met with many of his former enemies. He attended reunions of American fighter pilots, sharing stories and forming friendships with men he had once tried to kill. He spoke of the mutual respect that combat pilots felt for each other, regardless of which side they had fought on. When asked what he wanted Americans to know about Japanese pilots, Sakai had a simple answer. We were not fanatics. We were not robots. We were men doing what we believed was our duty. We fought for our country, just as you fought for yours. That is something warriors understand. Saburo Sakai died in 2000 at the age of 84. His final public appearance was at an American aviation event, where he was honored by the very pilots he had once fought against. Former enemies had become friends. The hatred of war had given way to the respect of warriors. The story of what Japanese pilots really thought about American pilots is a story of propaganda meeting reality. Tokyo told its people that Americans were cowards, that they lacked warrior spirit, that they would never stand against the might of Imperial Japan. The pilots who actually faced Americans in combat knew better. They saw American courage at Midway. They witnessed American determination at Guadalcanal. They experienced American dominance at the Philippine Sea. What stunned Tokyo was not that American pilots improved. What stunned them was how fast the improvement came. In 1941, Japanese pilots dominated the skies. By 1943, the contest was even. By 1944, America owned the air. The Japanese pilots who survived to tell their stories had one consistent message. They had been defeated not by machines, but by men. American pilots who learned, adapted, improved, and never gave up. Warriors who proved themselves the equal of any samurai. That was what Japanese pilots really thought about American pilots. That was what they told their commanders. That was what stunned Tokyo. And it was the truth.